Welcome to Writer's Life, an ongoing conversation with writers, authors, and folks in the publishing industry. I'm your host, Marvel Harrison, Publishing Director, Mimbres Press of Western New Mexico University. It is a pleasure to share a conversation today with J.J. Amaworo Wilson, who is a German-born Anglo-Nigerian American writer. His work has been published in the Penguin Book of New Black Writing, African American Review, Justice Journal, the New York Journal of Books, A Public Space, and many others. His 2016 novel, Damnificados, won 4 awards and was an Oprah top pick. His latest novel, published in 2021, which I'll get him to tell us about, won the Forward Indies Book Award and the Independent Publisher Book Award. Besides his fiction, he has written several books about language, which landed him honors at Buckingham Palace. He writes plays which have been produced on 4 continents, most recently and impressively Gaza, Palestine in 2021. Western New Mexico University proudly calls JJ Writer in Residence. Welcome to Writer's Life.
Thank you, Marvel. It's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, well, I'm so glad that you're joining us, and you have this illustrious language and writing career. You've lived all over the world, you've traveled extensively, and you're raising a beautiful young man that gets to play on the beaches of Brazil and the mountains of New Mexico. So good for you making all of that happen in someone's life.
Thank you.
So how did language and words and writing become such an integral part of who you are?
Well, I do actually have an origin story for that, Marvel. And that's when I was 10 years old. My father told us he was getting a book published. The book was called Elephants Don't Sit on Cars. And the subtitle was The Adventures of Jeremy James. Now, Jeremy James, I know everyone calls me JJ, but my real name is Jeremy James. And it turned out that my dad was publishing a children's book about a little boy with my name. It wasn't actually me, but it had my name. And that really changed my whole relationship with literacy and books, because I realized that if my dad could write a book, then anyone could do it. That's what I thought of my dad at the time. And so, of course, I read this book, and I loved it, and it was funny and charming. And so I sort of became a reader from that moment onwards, when I realized that even ordinary people like myself could appear in books, even though it wasn't really me. And then from then on, I just carried on reading. And gradually reading turned into writing. I studied English literature at the University of Edinburgh. And yeah, it's just been a thread throughout my life, I would say, reading and writing, along with a few other threads like sport and music. But reading and writing has always, from that age, around 10, it was really something important for me that I always continued.
So, right now, you have been focusing on fiction, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And that's a distance from where you have been in terms of some of your other teaching and work. But tell us more about what you're doing now.
Well, I've been working on fiction really since around 2014, 15. I've been publishing fiction for the best part of 2 decades, but full-length fiction, novels, have really just been in the last few years. It was something I always wanted to do, but I always found myself doing other things, writing. As you mentioned, I write books on language, I write educational books. I've written a lot on social justice issues. But really, because of what I like to read, which is mainly fiction, I've always felt that I was supposed to be a fiction writer. But I never actually got my acts together until a few years ago. And then all my influences, all the things I've read over the last 30, 40 years kind of coalesced into me finally finding my voice as a fiction writer. Now, you've mentioned that I lived in many different countries. And one of the things I always did when I was living in all those countries like Italy, Colombia, South Africa, was to read the literature of those nations. And so I had all these influences from all over the world. Like when I lived in Colombia, I read Gabriel Garcia Marquez. When I lived in Italy, I read Italo Calvino. I always read the literature wherever I was living. And I found really quite late on in life, in my 40s, all these influences coalescing, and I managed to find my own prose style for fiction. And so I've really continued that. I would say over the last, I don't know, 8 or 9 years, I've really focused heavily on fiction. It's just so pleasurable. It's just such a joy to write fiction, and such a feeling of achievement when you finish a whole novel, even if there's lots of editing to do, lots of work to do, and it's never perfect. Even when it's between two covers, it's never perfect. But it's a beautiful feeling to have actually written a whole book.
Well, there's lots of writers who are part of our channel. And when you said, I finally got my act together to be able to focus on writing fiction because that was, near and dear to you. What did getting your act together look and feel like?
Well, devoting enough time and energy, mental energy, to writing a story that endures, and that you live with. You live with those characters for maybe a year, maybe a couple of years, while you're writing that book. When you write a poem or a short story, you maybe live with that piece just for a few days or a few weeks, maybe a few months. When you're writing a novel, you're living with those characters. They're in your head day and night. You dream about them. And so I think it was just giving myself the chance to really live with those characters long term. I've also found that when you're really immersed in writing a book-length work like a novel, that everything around you, everything you read, see, hear, do, everything merges into the novel. You're constantly getting new ideas, which many of them end up in that novel because that's your alternative world. That's the little world you're living in inside your head. So I think that's what I meant by getting my act together, just giving myself the time and space.
Yeah, it's almost like making a cognitive decision. I mean, an intellectual decision that this is what I'm going to do now.
Yeah.
It's not like something magically happens. Although you have a really beautiful way with your magical realism, um, in terms of how you put your words together and that weaving of, oh, mythology and biblical history and clearly all the places you've been coming into this fabric of excitement. And I was thinking about almost there's not like a moral to it, but there's a story that has a really wonderful felt sense, in terms of the social justice.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I would say I've been heavily influenced not only by all my reading, but also all the places I've lived and all the cultures I've experienced. And all of that has found its way into my fiction. I mean, I think I write a very multicultural kind of fiction, possibly multilingual as well.
Mhm.
Certainly the influence of Spanish and books in Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, French, all of those influences are in my fiction, definitely. And also all the cultural things. Obviously, I'm part African. My mother was Nigerian. And so there are elements of her life that are in there as well. So I found with fiction, I'm weaving together many, many elements, which is a joyful thing for me.
Well, and I think it's one thing to do something eclectic, but you have this beautiful art form that comes out of all of these pieces. And that I applaud you because I think that's a challenging and really fantastic feat.
Thank
And
you.
you've done it. So tell us a little bit about your latest novel.
Yeah, the latest novel is called Nazareth, and it's not about, but it was inspired by the Arab Spring of around 2010, 2011. Um, so I'd read an awful lot about it when it was going on. Basically, Arab countries started to stand up against the dictatorships that had ruled them for so many decades. And this was really inspiring for me, partly because I'd actually lived in Egypt in my 20s, and I was still in touch with a few of the people involved in the Arab Spring, in sort of rising up against the dictatorship of Hosni Mubarak. Um, it didn't turn out very well in the end, or at the moment, it's not turning out very well for everyday Egyptians.
Right.
But the actual movement was very, very inspiring to me. And so I wanted to write about it, but I couldn't see a way of writing non-fiction about it without going there and, doing a bunch of research and interviewing people. And it was just, would have been overwhelming. So instead, I did some research on revolutions that was similar to the Arab Spring. I looked at the Cuban Revolution of 59 and 60 with Fidel Castro, etc. I looked at the French Revolution, all kinds of revolutions from across the world, and then tried to find commonalities between all those revolutions and then fictionalized it, which means I brought all those elements of fiction to this story of revolution. So language and characterization and humor and plot twists. Because regardless of what I think about the political situation, the Arab Spring, a novel has to be entertaining. It has to be an entertainment. So I was very aware of that I wanted it to be a fun thing to read, not just a sort of moral message about what we should do with dictators and autocrats and how we should fight against them. So I was very conscious of having elements of humor and fun characters. And of course, as you mentioned, language is so important to me. So I eventually weaved together all my research into revolutions, elements of the Arab Spring, and all the things I've been talking about, like characters and different, language and languages, and wrote about this sort of peasants' revolt against the dictatorship. And the novel has been very well received. As you mentioned, it's already won a few awards. It's been shortlisted for some others, which I'm waiting to hear about. And I think it's a fun read, even though there's obviously a very strong moral, ethical element to it. The idea is that it's a fun read also.
I think it's a fun read without having a judgmental direction of how the reader is supposed to be experiencing it. I think it's a really wonderful invitation for those of us who don't spend a lot of time reading about revolutions, but we can learn so much about the nuances of human condition through fiction. And I'm really hopeful that this book might end up in lots of book clubs, because
Me too.
I think it will. Well, I know from your standpoint, let's get that book out there. But from my standpoint, I think as much about just having those really important conversations that a book like this can be the footprint for, and without dictating how one is supposed to be processing or thinking about it. So congratulations on the awards.
Thank you.
And I have every reason to believe that you're writing something new. Is there something on your scope right now?
Yeah, I'm just kind of starting, so I can't talk too much about it because I don't want to jinx it. But among the many trends in the world, and I guess a lot of them are related, we have the trend of immigration and refugees. I'm talking about millions of people having to move around, having to leave their country and move to different environments. forcibly moved to different environments. And so I'm very interested in what happens to the psyche. I'm interested in what happens to the family, to the community when this occurs. All my movements around the world have been voluntary. I'm in an incredibly privileged position whereby I have an education. I grew up in England. But I'm wondering what life is like for those who are not so lucky and have to move really to save their lives and save their families' lives. So I'm still in the early stages, as I said, but I'm writing something about refugees.
Ah, well, there's such a difference between a refugee and an immigrant, right?
Yes, of course, yeah.
I immigrated from Canada, incredibly also privileged because it was a choice about where do I go to school, where do I want to live. I have these abilities, both, through the privilege of my race, but the people I was born to, and the formative basis of all of that. And I think I'm glad you're writing about immigration, about refugees, about movement around the world, because it has happened for all time. We kind of talk about it being a current issue or concern,
Mm.
but there is nothing new
No,
about any of it. So,
no, true, true. But perhaps what's new is the numbers and the volume, and also the fact that it's highlighted more now because of things like social media
mhm,
and because of the political climate in which we live.
mhm,
Um, Immigration has become, it's become a very political issue. It's very politicized,
mhm.
and so maybe it's more on people's radar than it was in the past. Perhaps.
Mhm. Oh, well, I'll be looking forward to that too.
Thank you.
But before we end, you do you're a writer in residence at Western New Mexico University. Thank you for that. And you do writing group, I mean, not groups, but residencies, more temporary in other places. What
Yes.
what do you like to leave to new writers? What are your thoughts of the long track you've been on?
Many things, actually. There are both macro and micro issues that I try to teach when I go around giving workshops. And I teach at Stonecoast at the University of Southern Maine.
Mhm.
Also, I just go on the residency twice a year. So macro issues are really they echo the title of this YouTube series, Writer's Life. I try and teach them um, the big things about being a writer because it really is it's a way of being in the world. You have to be constantly observing. You have to be aware of what's happening in the world. Um, you're always on the lookout for stories. These are just things that all writers do, and that's how we live. And then, of course, there are micro issues which go down so micro, Marvel. They're things like how to put the comma in the right place. They're really micro things on how to write better. So it's all kinds of things. It's the verb tenses that you use. It's how to write an effective sentence, an effective paragraph, how to use adjectives effectively. It's all kind. We really get down to the nitty gritty. So it's really everything, macro and micro. I guess one of the things I also try to do in some way is to inspire the students to make them think, yes, they can also get their work out there, get their work published. They can write great work. They don't have to have any great educational qualifications. You don't have to be super smart or anything. You just need that motivation to keep writing every day, keep working at your craft. Writing, like any other skill, is something you can improve the more you do it. If you do it regularly, you're going to get better. If you seek a mentor, someone to actually help you, you're going to get better if that mentor's any good. So it's a skill like any other skill, and that's one of the main things I try to impart to the students that I teach.
So just to summarize that very briefly, it's like there's a need to be present, to be
Yes.
observant, to be able to assimilate the world around you, and to hone your technical
Yeah.
skills,
Yeah.
and to have that spirit within that keeps you going forward, having confidence both in your technical ability, but more in the ability to be part of the world.
Yeah. That's a pretty good summary. I mean, obviously, I'm summarizing, I'm making generalizations. There's so much to it. It's like when you listen, you have to really listen to how people talk. When you see things, when you observe the world, you're seeing the same as everyone else, but you have to look at it with a writer's eyes, and you have to find the details. It's all about the details. How does that moonbeam reflect off the tree? You really got to look carefully in a way that perhaps non-writers don't have to. And then, even then, when you've observed and listened, your job is only half done, because then you have to put it into words. It's not about getting something onto paper, it's about getting something into someone else's head. So then there's the whole other issue of putting the right words in the right order. So I'm not going to say it's simple being a writer, but there are some basic things we can teach.
Well, thank you for being a part of that teaching world because, as it turns out, people are reading more than they have, and at least as a reflection of how book sales are going. And I find that invigorating because I want more people to. I mean, there's programs throughout pediatrics about Reach Out and Read, where pediatricians are reading a book to every child and giving it to them at every well child appointment. I think those are really just really tiny steps, but quite critical in terms of how we can challenge how we think about things. And I will very much look forward to um, your next piece of work, and I'm sure it'll be just as invigorating as the ones I've read. So,
Thank you, Marvel. Thank you.
JJ, what are you reading now? What's something that you personally are being touched by at this point?
Okay, I'm actually rereading a novel by Cormac McCarthy called Blood Meridian. Um, I don't want to, I don't want to put a dampener on it, but I'm rereading it because I'm giving a workshop on it in January. I'm giving a talk about writing great villains, and there happens to be a great villain in this novel. Um, but I'm constantly reading about four different things at a time. I do a lot of book reviewing also, and I'm reading a collection of short stories called Night of the Living Res by a friend, a colleague of mine called Morgan Tulty. He's a Native American writer. So I'm writing a review of that. It's his new book. I also, I can't remember if I told, I read in other languages as well. So I'm reading a couple of books in Portuguese as well, which are they're actually about revolutions. So, I can't stop reading and writing about revolutions. So I'm constantly reading fiction and non-fiction at the same time. My wife thinks I'm insane in that I'm reading a different book every day. But, that's just the way I function.
Well, actually, I'm not surprised you're reading more on revolutions because I think that also fuels that whole topic of movement of people, of refugees, migration, and what needs to get, how where people need to find security and safety in the world. So,
That's right. Absolutely. Yeah.
it's been a joy to speak with you today, JJ, and thanks to everyone who's joined us.
Thank
I'm
you, Marvel.
I'm Marvel Harrison, and from all of us at Mimbres Press, may your day be sparked with curiosity and wonder, and see you again on the next Writer's Life.